Hello, everyone. I'm Stephen Robinson. Welcome to the Play Typer Guy podcast. It is Friday, July 19th, 4:37 p.m. I know that seems like a hostage video proof of life statement, but I'm doing that because as we record this, everything is changing and, and developing and going in crazy directions regarding Joe Biden and his reelection campaign. Right before I came on here, to start this podcast, I Ohio Senator Sherrod Brown came forward to say that Biden should end his campaign. And fortunately, I have with me Cliston Brown, political analyst, who has always been sort of this sea of calm regarding a lot of what's happening. So I want to kind of turn it over to you, Cliston, if you could kind of explain in your own words sort of the state of the Biden reelection campaign and perhaps maybe your thoughts on how we got to this point.
Well, hello, Stephen, and thank you for having me on your podcast. I really appreciate the invitation. You mentioned that I'm a sea of calm. I'm reminded of the saying about the duck that looks really, really calm on the surface, but is furiously moving its legs under the water. And that's kind of how I feel at the moment. The Biden campaign, if I can summarize it succinctly, is sort of like the Hindenburg after the explosion at this point. It's really, I've never seen anything like it before in my life. I have never seen a presidential campaign disintegrate like this, and I lived through the Michael Dukakis campaign. I mean, and I'm not given to hyperbole. We've followed each other on X or Twitter, as I still prefer to call it, for quite a long time. I think you know that I try to keep a pretty level head. But honestly, this is really terrible. I mean, every hour today, some new member of Congress has come out calling for President Biden to step off the ticket. A few moments ago, or maybe an hour ago, Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio came out asking President Biden to step off the ticket. We had Jon Tester of Montana asking President Biden to step off the ticket. Now, one thing that I have really, really noticed since this whole thing began with Democrats coming out publicly asking their own president to step aside, which again, I've never seen in my lifetime. What I notice is that the Democrats who are really, really sticking with President Biden at this point generally all come from safe districts, safe states. They don't have anything to worry about. The people who are in close or difficult races are the people who are coming out asking President Biden to step off the ticket. And there's a reason for this. Over the last 20 years, there has been a tendency toward a correlation between the presidential race and what happens in House and Senate races. And it's been growing virtually every cycle. And we've gotten to a point now where in the last two presidential elections, 2016 and 2020, there were 69 Senate races during those two cycles. 68 of them followed suit. Whatever party the state favored for the presidential race, they also favored for Senate.
Mm-hmm.
In 2020, there were only 16 House races in the entire country out of 435, 3.7%, that did not follow suit and vote for the same presidential candidate and House candidate of the same party. And of those 16, it was almost an even split. 9 Republicans were elected and Biden won seats. 7 Democrats were elected and Trump won seats. And so we have a divergence in the Senate and House of less than 2% of all races functionally that diverge.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I'm Sherrod Brown, if I'm Jon Tester, if I'm Tammy Baldwin, if I'm Bob Casey, and I see the way that the Biden campaign is going right now, I'm thinking, hell, I'm going to lose my seat.
Oh yeah, I like the president. I've liked what he's done. He's done, but he's been profoundly unpopular, by any objective measure. And people have disagreed with me about this. They've already, but he's been underwater since 2021. And this year he is under 40%. And so people talk about, well, Barack Obama, Romney was ahead in some polls, and look, well, what about President Kerry? Ha ha ha. It's like, okay, well, again, around this time, George Bush, W. Bush, was heading towards, again, 50% approval.
Yeah.
which can help with the fundamentals and so forth. And um, Barack Obama also upward trajectory. Biden's still below 40% in the 30s. And this is after, like, generally speaking, if you're doing poorly in a political campaign, my experience, your kind of Hail Mary is, well, maybe my opponent will get indicted on major felonies. Maybe I've got that, but that seems to have kind of that's already happened. So like I don't know what other October surprise, like he's a lizard. Everyone's like, we like the lizard. Oh my
Yeah.
God, what's going on? So what do you think explains this consistent degree of like essentially one of the least popular presidents, again in our lifetime as far as a continued underwater approval?
Certainly one of the things that we have seen consistently, um, even though inflation has stabilized, prices are still very high. And this is something I hear from people all the time. I'm on X or Twitter, whatever you prefer to call it, quite a bit, but I'm out in the real world more. And I give a lot of talks on politics at corporate events, and I talk to a lot of what we call on in political Twitter world normies. And what I hear from them generally comes down to two things: God, Biden's old, isn't he? And you know, prices are so high. It's like my paycheck isn't going where as far as it used to go. And we hear all these people saying, yeah, but studies show that things are going better, and people aren't really understanding it. It's never a good idea to go to your average voter and say, "Oh, what are you talking about? You're not struggling. Things are going great. What's wrong with you? You're an idiot." Yeah, that's a winning political strategy.
Unemployment is much lower than it was in 2004, which is 5%. It's 4% now. So it's like 5% in 2004 with Bush, and then 8% with Obama in 2012. And many have argued that it's to Obama's amazing skill as a politician. One of the reasons the Romney campaign was confident that it could win was that
Mhm.
the fundamentals, generally speaking, were against Obama. Like unemployment was high, the Affordable Care Act was pretty unpopular at the time. So his ability to overcome that was impressive. But you know, what I saw is that okay, well, inflation, unemployment might be low, but when inflation is high, you know, there's fewer people who, sad to say, but even with 8% unemployment, that's 8% of Americans, opposed to every American feeling inflation. What do you,
Exactly
which
right.
something that Obama did that was very good was like, okay, well, this guy isn't going to help you the way I can. Things are tough, but I'm going to do a better job at this. And that became the choice that people made by painting Romney as somebody who didn't care about them very well. Um, and, Biden has clearly struggled about that.
Yeah.
Like, Trump is leading him in better able to handle the economy, which is a degree of, I get it, a degree of amnesia regarding that. But to me, he's winning, of course, on ability to handle a crisis, despite
Mhm.
overseeing the worst crisis in our lifetimes, the COVID pandemic. So a lot of this is just he's not been effectively communicating that.
Yeah.
Um,
And
but
it
if it
should be a slam dunk. I mean, Donald Trump is one of the last people I would ever want to be in charge during a crisis, as he proved with his inept, insane response to the COVID pandemic in 2020.
Yeah, and I haven't seen them hitting him that hard or reminding them. And I've written about this for Public Notice and other publications of like Democrats sometimes struggle to find what to attack about Donald Trump. So with Romney, they had a clear narrative, and then
Mhm.
here it's just okay. Well, he sleeps with adult film stars. Okay, or he does this. He's mean. He lies, or he does this, or whatever. He's this, and it's like all over as opposed to. And I've said, look, people know that there are assholes in the world, but sometimes they think, oh, this asshole can do the job, as
Yeah.
opposed to the kind of feeble old man. Strong and wrong wins over weak and right, as
Yeah.
former President Bill Clinton said. And I think that's been a disconnect Democrats have had. They've done something that I feel like, again, doesn't really play well in the Rust Belt or amongst normal Americans, where it's like, hey, look at Trump, he eats Big Macs, he's a kind of walking heart attack. And like, look at Biden on that bike in Martha's Vineyard. It's like, okay, it's like, I'm sorry, but like, yeah, he's thinner, but to me, average people tend to think that he presents as frailer and softer voice, like he is old. And I've never, to your point, I kept trying to convince people as early as 2021, like, of course he will run again. That's what happens. Presidents, and they're like, that's crazy. He's like, he'd be 80. That doesn't make any sense. He's definitely not going to run again. I like him, but he's not going to run again. And he did. And the question for that seemed like it felt like he got the wrong lesson from the midterms, where his approval, despite his low approval, the party didn't get wiped out. A part of that, of course, is Dobbs backlash, but also the strong candidates. Many of them we're hearing names of now: Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan, Tony Evers winning re-election, and Mark Kelly winning re-election, Raphael Warnock. And so it's like, oh, well, there was no red wave in the Senate. Democrats held the Senate, even though being predicted to not do. It, obviously I can ride the fundamentals despite the low approval. I'm going to run for re-election. And to me, that might have been the fatal choice, because it was more of just, no. Maybe if you had stepped down then, open primary, and then we could ride the fundamentals with a nominee and do much better. What's your take on that?
When I hear people talking about how, Democrats won the midterms because of Joe Biden, I'm reminded of the rooster who crows in the morning and somebody saying, oh, well, the rooster made the sun rise. Joe Biden had absolutely nothing to do with the Democratic performance in 2022. The most valuable player there would probably be Clarence Thomas and his buddies on the Supreme Court, who, had the lack of wisdom to overturn Roe v. Wade in the middle of an election year. And certainly that was a big problem. As you pointed out, we had some very, very good candidates, which makes a difference. And certainly, that kind of mitigated the losses that a president's party will normally have. But what we lose sight of is, we had smaller losses, but we still lost the House. It was not an unmitigated triumph by any means. And so there was just, to put it bluntly, and perhaps in a slightly vulgar way, Democrats have just been blowing smoke up their own asses for the last 2 years.
Yeah. So a lot of this, as you said, is stuff that's by blowing smoke up our own asses, like now it's come to a head to bite us, because that choice, despite the clear evidence, despite the sense of maybe people aren't going to feel like an 86-year-old president is a good idea. And I still see it whenever you meet someone that's like, that's only the media. The media has concocted a scheme to make people think that Joe Biden is old, and it's ageism. If people don't like these isms, as if there's an ism test. You have to go through DEI training before you can vote. That's not how it works. So look, if someone thinks he's too old, it's the reality, right?
The level of denial on this particular point has been so off the charts. A few days ago on social media, somebody actually responded to me by talking about what Biden's age would be at the end of his second term, which is 86. They actually said, 86 isn't that old. Yeah, if you're a tree.
Yes. Well, he's not a time lord. Like he's not going to regenerate during his term. 86 is actually, like, normal people are having discussions regarding their parents in their late 70s, certainly in their early 80s, about whether they should still be driving.
One of the things that has just been very hard to deal with has been the fact that, and this is not to say this of all Democrats, but Democrats as a rule are very, very slow to adjust to new realities.
Mhm.
And what I mean by that is this. Conventional wisdom is once an incumbent president loses an election, he goes away and you never hear from him again.
Mhm.
But Donald Trump was not a conventional president. He's not a conventional human being. I told everybody 4 years ago when Donald Trump lost, he will run again and he will win the Republican nomination. We better be prepared for that. And people told me I was nuts. If I had $1 for every time people told me that I was nuts, I ended up being right, I could probably retire. And I'm not saying that to pat myself on the back, but what benefits me in what I try to do is that I am scrupulously objective. And that lack of objectivity leads to a condition of not really seeing things for as they are. And that's one of our biggest problems as a party. We see things the way we want them to be, and we think that's reality. And the problem is that is not reality.
Mhm.
And we got to learn to deal in reality. And the reality is an egotist like Donald Trump was not going to take losing that election sitting down.
Mhm.
And he was going to come back and, try to prove to everyone that he was cheated, he was robbed, and he's going to come back and he's going to do this thing because Donald Trump is extremely vain and egotistical, and we should all know that.
Yeah, but we also love comeback stories, right?
Right.
To the extent of, it's not about you have to give it to Hitler type stuff, but it's more of like to the extent that that resonates with people.
There were a lot of things that were going in Joe Biden's direction in 2020 that he doesn't have going for him today. And one that is not talked about by anybody so far as I can tell is the fact that because of the COVID pandemic in 2020, there was much wider access to mail balloting. A number of states that expanded their access to mail balloting, including Pennsylvania and Michigan, have pulled back on that quite a bit.
Mhm.
So Joe Biden got 81 million votes, but that was unprecedented turnout, partly driven by the fact that people didn't have to go stand in line at a polling place. They could just mail in a ballot. And that option is not available everywhere anymore. And I think we're going to see a lot of rescission in terms of that. I think we're going to see lower turnout. I think that we are going to see, a lot of the swing voters who were disgusted with Trump now say, you know what? I didn't like Trump. He does some things that bother me. But I don't think Biden can actually be president anymore. I don't think he can run the country effectively. And so, if I'm not an ideological person, and I don't pay attention like the average voter generally doesn't to all the nuances of what the Republican Party stands for and what the Democratic Party stands for, and I just see Donald Trump versus Joe Biden, and I see Joe Biden falling off of a bicycle, and I, see this happening, and I don't know anything else. I don't pay attention to anything else. And then I look back and think, well, the economy was going gangbusters. Gas didn't cost so much, eggs didn't cost so much, and there are reasons for that. Some of which have to do with the fact that Trump completely screwed up on the COVID pandemic. But people just look at what they see on the surface, and a lot of voters vote based on those surface type things. They don't get into the weeds the way that the, politierati
Mhm.
do on Twitter.
Yeah, and I want to ask you about that um, historic train wreck debate because original response to that was like folks who are freaking out were being bedwetters and look, we're going to stay the course and all of this. And as I have facetiously put it, this is like a bad debate. This is 1992, Bill Clinton coming on stage and making out with Jennifer Flowers for 90 minutes in front of 51 million people. This is in 2008, Barack Obama coming on stage in a dashiki and giving a Jeremiah Wright style rant about Whitey for 90 minutes in front of 51 million people. I have never, again in my lifetime, you said this before, as students of politics or whatever, I have never seen a candidate reinforce
Yeah.
their greatest liability to 51 more people than are going to watch a Lester Holt interview or anything else. And at this point, what's your take on the debate and why Democrats and others might have responded to it as we've started to see?
Until that debate, I had arrived at the conclusion a long time ago that debates don't matter. But in this case, what was different about this was, as you pointed out, Joe Biden went on screen and reinforced his main liability, which is that he is old and that people have suspected for some time that he might not be totally with it. And he went out on stage and he looked old and he looked like he wasn't totally with it. That was very, very damaging. And you know what? If you and I are bedwetters, then Sherrod Brown and John Tester and Adam Schiff and Nancy Pelosi are all bedwetters too.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't believe that for a minute. These are some of the most stalwart members of the party who have their finger on the pulse of where the country is. We talk about all these people who are coming out, all these members of Congress who are coming out saying that President Biden should step aside. The reason that these people got to Congress is because they have their finger on the pulse of their constituents. They know what's going on out there. And what they are seeing is he's going to lose and he's going to drag us all down with him.
Yeah. And I've seen, part of the context with this is that, they see people say, don't trust polls. You've already been consistent about polls are garbage, though you've also said, they can't be often as wrong by like 30 points, like stuff like that. But, polls, internal polls, finger on the pulse. These are people who their constituents are contacting them.
Correct.
It's not, Joe Biden's campaign manager is talking, I think today, about people coming up to them at events and saying, go, Joe, go. That's at events. It's like, yeah, go to a Comic-Con. They're going to tell you to make more Marvel movies. That doesn't mean anything. Here, people, actual constituents calling and saying, yeah, what's going on with this guy? That's what they're hearing. And again, it was a new Democrat coalition, mostly moderates. They'd requested the meeting with Biden. They'd asked, what's your plan? So that's why when I get upset when people are kind of like, oh, the bedwetters want to dump Biden and replace him without a plan. Well, there is a plan. I think it's a risky plan, but they went to Biden of like, okay, what's your plan to win? We're down. And they were getting nothing. They're getting like, he doesn't think he's losing. You thought I was down in 2020 and I won then. And
nobody thought Biden was down in 2020.
Exactly.
He was in the whole race. Everybody expected he was going to win. I thought that he was going to win by a larger margin than he did. I missed 3 states in that election because the polling, which I no longer pay any attention to, partly because of what happened in 2020, indicated that he was going to win North Carolina, that he was going to win Florida, that he was going to win Ohio, for heaven's sake. Polling had him dead even or slightly ahead in Ohio, and he lost Ohio by 8 points.
Yeah, and then about the same as Hillary Clinton, Houston, Ryan, Texas. And when these leaders are going to the president and not getting, like, I think someone in a Colorado district that was like, Democrat a partisan lean of 6 points or whatever, was like, none of this that you're telling me is breaking through the voters. Biden was talking about his greatest president, all these achievements, and stuff about NATO, which I think of the single mom just trying to single mom in the Rust Belt, works 2 jobs. You've got to connect with her. It is not reaching, yelling Project 2025 at this woman. What is going to, so people have been saying it's only white people who's trying to force out Biden. This is about white people who want to ignore how Black people voted in the North Korean style primary we had. They want to ignore that. And it's like, okay, well, yes, you could break that into it. But what a fair-minded person might say is that, well, fair or not, most Black people who are elected to Congress are in safe Democratic seats. Going back to what you had said earlier, their issue is going to be being primaried rather than losing. They're less reliant on independents and white voters who are independents. And so it's not just that Sherrod Brown doesn't care about Black people from Kanye West. It is just that he is looking at the data in a different way.
Whether we like it or not, the voter who is going to decide this election is a 40-something white woman in Wisconsin with a high school diploma.
Yeah.
How do you get to her? Well, all the stuff that we're talking about is not how you get to her. I grew up in the heart of the Rust Belt, right outside Gary, Indiana, the Steel City. You know, I know the Rust Belt very, very well. I lived more than the first half of my life there. And what we're doing isn't going to get it. And that's what we don't get. And we get into all these weird permutations and ideas. The weirdest flex of this entire crazy cycle has been to be told that I am an out-of-touch white racist because I am suggesting that a white man who can no longer do the job should step aside for a highly qualified Black woman. That's how messed up this whole thing has gotten.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes, because you're setting her up to fail. It's better that she...
Oh, yes, that's our evil plan. You know, let's throw Kamala Harris out there to the wolves so we can push her aside and put a white woman on top of the ticket in 2028. That's not the way I think. Yeah. I want to win.
Something that someone commented on, I wish I could remember who did, on election night in 2016, when Trump, you know, because it looked very good based on early voting that Hillary's going to win. Yeah. And the numbers coming from places like he was well exceeding Romney's numbers in places that were, you know, you expect Republicans to do well, but he was blowing the doors off, bringing in these irregular white voters. And what someone said was that, you know, when you start to veer into something that it wasn't something that Clinton did, it wasn't something that Obama did, but it started to kind of occur. You start to become an identity party, the minority identity party, then Republicans might become the white identity party, where they vote based on their white identity. If that happens, you're screwed. Mm-hmm. Because there's more of, you know, to get into heavy math here, Cliston, there are more white people than minorities in America. And I'll drop this clip in when I edit this later. Joy Reid, who I love, but still, she was stating on MSNBC, like, well, Republicans just becoming the white male, white adjacent minority party. It's like, okay, well, yeah, that's bad because they will win.
You know, it's interesting because we were talking about this during the break. I mean, this is the Javier Milei election, right? I mean, and then in Argentina, that's how that went, which is that you had this coalition of, and not to be cruel, but it was described as sort of an incel election. It was the young, angry men of Argentina who, like, they wanted a macho candidate, and it went along with policies like banning abortion, banning birth control, and the idea of no-fault divorce. It all kind of goes together. That you've seen this kind of election before. You see the same thing in Hungary, like the Orbanism of the party it's rooted in returning white Christian men, but also white men and white adjacent men, Black men, brown men who are like white adjacent in terms of trying to also be in that dominant position in society. And then you have women who are willing to go along with that, right? There are a certain number of women who are also willing, the trad wife sort of thing. And so what you've seen on
the numbers being what they are. I mean, the country is still basically close to 2/3 white. Mm-hmm. But then you get into some of these swing states like Wisconsin, where the electorate is 87% white. The bottom line is, if a Democrat cannot get at least 40% of the white vote, they're screwed.
People are presenting the stakes very clearly that, for me, there's a gun to my head. Mm-hmm. This is what's going to happen to me. So then, have Democrats commuted that there's a gun to your head specifically? I don't think so. So, for you, it's still a choice. So if it's a choice, a party that has to win has to convince people who, if Trump's in office, the world is not going to end for them. Even all the Project 2025 stuff are things that like, oh yeah, that sucks. That's not going to win the Rust Belt. None of this is, and that's scary to me because it's like who are you communicating to? What's your thought on that? Like, who are Democrats communicating to?
Each other. And that's the problem. I keep telling people in social media and wherever, get out of your bubble and talk to some people who aren't doing politics 24/7, 365, and just listen to what they have to say. And you'll start to understand that not everybody thinks like we do. Democrats spend so much time talking to each other. And we also have a big problem in that we're too much of an Ivy League party.
Mm-hmm.
We have all of these intellectuals in our party who don't understand the average voter, probably haven't spent a lot of time around the average voter. And we're so stuck in these clouds that we're in, this ivory tower that we're in. And all we communicate with is each other. And we're not hearing what normal people, and I don't mean that pejoratively against those of us like myself who are probably not entirely normal, but we're not communicating with the people who are actually going to decide the election.
Oh yeah, they don't. There's a lot of bottle minority issues at play in the Democrats. So and when they'll talk about the success, it's like, look at Hakeem Jeffries. Look at I think Biden was talking about achievements, or a Biden fan was talking about Biden's achievements. It was like the first Black woman on the Supreme Court, the first Black woman president. Well, these are always very successful Black women. That's great. Mm-hmm. But you need the Black person, the Black man who might vote for Trump, who had voted for Obama, and there's a good chance of that. I think we're going to potentially see, despite a former white colleague of mine looking at possible results and just saying affirmatively bullshit, impossible. Okay. Well, not my experience. It's very possible, because that just doesn't resonate to them as much, especially in the Supreme Court. That's like a total fascist nightmare state. There's nothing more, reflective of our sense of identity politics is that I would actually go to voters and say, look, I put a Black woman on a Supreme Court that is a fascist nightmare state that overturned Roe v. Wade on my watch, that made Trump a dictator. But, one of the dissents is a Black woman and not a white man. That's great. It's like, oh, right. Well, I'll feel better about that at my re-education camp. And I'm not diminishing that impact, but it's like the idea that anyone that you're leading with your Supreme, whereas if Trump leads about the Supreme Court, it's like, look what I just did. It's 6-3. That's an actual objective that's been achieved. And I said, I will drop it in later, where Simone Sanders had said that specifically, we are not facilitating a primary process. So this is Simone Sanders on television, like when I think at that time it was RFK, Dean Phillips, and Marianne Williamson. And she was like, we're not facilitating a primary process.
I really think that the mealy-mouthed Democrats, as I like to call them, and some of my progressive friends who would like to live in a fantasy land, they need to come back to reality. Yeah. And the reality is this. The sitting president of the United States of America is a Democrat that would like to run for re-election, so much so that he has declared a re-election campaign. Right. In that case, the Democratic National Committee will not facilitate a primary process. There will be no debate stage for Bobby Kennedy, Marianne Williamson, or anyone else to stand on.
So we're going to have another Bobby Kennedy
and that makes perfect sense. The problem is that later, when people are like, oh my God, I don't think this guy can win, I don't think you can ethically then say, oh, but he won a primary. So what do you think? What do you think about that?
One of the complaints that I hear is that all of these people voted for Biden. I voted for Biden in the primaries. Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. What was our choice? We had Marianne Williamson and Dean Phillips. It's sort of like, me saying, that college basketball team that just won 207-6 against the fifth grade basketball team at Evans Elementary School is unbeatable. Look, they won by 200 points. Well, of course they did, because they didn't have any competition.
Mm-hmm. And, Trump did not show up for debates in
Yeah.
the Republican primary, but even that was arguably, by comparison, more of a real primary. Like
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Nikki Haley, Ron DeSantis, they came at him. They tried to differentiate between them. They are also people you would consider Republican rising stars, for good or for ill.
Right.
And that obviously wasn't what Biden was facing. Biden didn't have a primary where, for example, Gretchen Whitmer, Gavin Newsom, Josh Shapiro were crossing the country, running, presenting their vision of the future and distinguishing their vision from Biden's, and even hammering Biden seriously. I mean, that would have been a potentially different story. And, as people said, like, and I think this goes to Sherrod Brown and others, because there's been polling, just if you believe this, so there's been pushback against one of the reveals of this, but there's a sense that voters don't necessarily trust people their representatives who say Biden's got this, because they think, like, I don't think he's got this. Like, what are you just trying to are you trying to, like, sell me a bill of goods here? And there's also the perception that, okay, well, I obviously don't hang out with the president. First time I saw him, in years, was at the debate, right? Okay, but you apparently do, and you were telling me he's great, and you endorsed him, and, like, were you, like, hoping to cover this up? And there is that sense, because the idea that, like, I don't think obviously there's intent to cover up Biden's challenges, I presume, because they had obviously moved up the debate to before the convention, as opposed to afterward, which would have been a disaster. But I guess that is my question for you. Like, again, what did they think that he would do well, like, within that inner circle, who should know better?
I don't know what they were thinking, because what we're seeing out of President Biden, I'm sad to say, is nothing new. And one thing that I would talk about that nobody's bringing up, let's go back to 2020. Joe Biden didn't run a particularly great campaign in 2020 either. He had some things going on that year that benefited him, like the COVID pandemic, which, gave him a little leeway to not be out on the stump all the time.
Absolutely.
But if you go back and you look at the Democratic nominating process, if you look at his performance in those debates, it wasn't good. And you look at how he performed in the early states, and we talk about the deficiencies of Iowa and New Hampshire in terms of not looking like the country as a whole. But he didn't just lose in those states. He got slaughtered, single digits.
Oh, yeah.
And in the end, when South Carolina went heavily for him, and South Carolina in its own way is not representative of the nation.
Absolutely.
Then you had this consolidation behind him very, very quickly among all the moderate Democrats who feared that if they didn't get out and unite behind one candidate, that Bernie Sanders might win the nomination.
Yes, that is it. I keep pointing to this, but that brings me to a larger question. Someone like yourself who monitors politics and kind of gets the breakdown of how things go. We had 4 years of Trump to sort of build up, to figure out where we were as a party, what we're going to do. Our two front runners were the 80-year-old socialist and the 80-year-old, moderate, who's never been a particularly great politician. And it was kind of shocking to me. I mean, even with Buttigieg and Klobuchar, they're, neither of them having great relationships with the Black community, which is strange, because that will be necessary in a primary. And if you look at the Republicans, the Republican primary, by the time you start to run, you've already, like, kind of made your bones with the evangelicals or with those people. Like in North Carolina, Mark Robinson, people talk about him. He's a nut job, and I'm terrified he's going to win as part of this election. But he was someone, again, came up through talk radio, speaking that language of the people in the primary. But that wasn't Buttigieg and Klobuchar in certain ways, again, were part of the MSNBC primary, which is not reflective of either the primary or the nation. So it just seemed like, well, if Biden was the best bet, and Biden's very much an older style Democrat, where was the bench of, like, this is what our party is, and this is where we need to win, and look at the map, and how do we build up a candidate who can do that. Like, are you seeing any of those efforts, or what's your thought on this?
I think that we were in kind of a tight spot in 2020, and that some of the people who are emerging as stars in the Democratic Party now, such as Gretchen Whitmer, Josh Shapiro, hadn't really risen yet.
Mm-hmm.
And so the crop of candidates that we had in 2020 really wasn't that good. And it was horrible timing to not have the kind of bench that we needed. There's a lot of talk about how Joe Biden was the only candidate in 2020 who could have beaten Donald Trump. You know, on one hand, out of the selection that we had, maybe that was true. But on the other hand, what does it say about the Democratic Party if the best we can do is a 78-year-old politician who, frankly, the first 2 times he ran for president, the first time he couldn't even get into the primaries, much less out of them, because he imploded over a plagiarism scandal. And the second time, he was an also ran. And this was our great hope. You know, so what does it say about our party if we couldn't put somebody forward in 2020 to run against somebody like Donald Trump, who would be, you know, somewhat younger, maybe more dynamic, maybe a better politician?
Absolutely.
So we have some soul searching to do as a party to answer that question.
Well, and another thing for observation for you is that I've seen this before, and maybe you had made this observation, was that we're sort of also paying the price for some of what had occurred during the Obama administration, the wipeout at the, you know, state houses, governorships, where those folks would be coming from, especially in the Midwest, and what became, you know, the last places standing is sort of your senator from California, your, you know, senator from New York, like the coast to coast.
Your mayor from South Bend, Indiana.
Which is, you know, he's from the Midwest at least, but yes, but not, he's not a governor. He's not a senator. He's not someone, you know, the typical rising path. So that has been damage to us that I think we're starting to make up, I guess. God knows what's happened while we've been talking regarding Biden, but what could be like, because I've seen weird, ridiculous statements about what's depressing to me, which is sort of like, we should just do nothing and accept defeat. And I don't know, to me, like, what would voters respect less? So, you know, the Titanic crew just doesn't see the iceberg. They're like looking the other way. They're smoking it out. All right, fine. The Titanic crew saw the iceberg, had a plan, executed it. It wasn't a great plan. Hit the iceberg. Titanic crew sees the iceberg. It's like, I don't know. The plans are difficult. I don't know if we can get on the iceberg ballot in Ohio. And then let's like, iceberg might still try to hit us. And let's get it. Like, the first 2 people I will like, those people are losers, right? Like, I don't like, I want nothing to do with you. You're just like, that's just so unacceptable to me.
100%. I mean, we should be trying to win every election. Accepting defeat is the weakest thing you can do. And there's a difference between warning somebody that the iceberg is coming and saying, well, we're going to hit the iceberg anyway. What are you going to do? Learn how to swim.
And, you know, look, I mean, the idea that Biden could, that what I've heard, like, polls are all wrong. He can turn it around, even though, again, these Democratic leaders have talked to him and gotten no sense of a plan other than everyone will realize Donald Trump is a criminal. Okay. And and all of his, also, and I think where people are bailing is all of the theories of the campaign have not borne fruit, right? So the idea would be, okay, his approval levels are low, but when they don't think Trump's going to be the nominee, once it happens and it's real, then we're going to start seeing it in the polls, and that didn't happen, right?
Well, it hasn't yet. I do believe that there will be some movement back toward Biden if he remains the candidate. Right now, we do see that his numbers are extremely low. And I think that's in part because people are still convinced or hoping that he won't be the candidate. I do believe that there will be some movement back in his direction, but I'm not sure that's going to be enough because, even if Biden does get back all the Democrats who right now aren't willing to say they support him, you still can't win with just that. You still got to win people in the middle who are not ideological, who don't know much about what either party stands for, and all they know is that they see two guys on TV, one who is maybe a little loopy and crazy, but appears strong, and this other guy who's falling off his bike.
Oh yeah. Well, and Cliston, you talk about the real world. It's like something that people will say, like, "Oh, Trump disqualified himself. It's obviously crazy," and it's like, well, you just don't. You're not listening to Fox News. You're not listening to right-wing radio. He just sounds like any of those assholes on that. I don't like any of them, but that to me is not inherently disqualifying to that single because that
no, not at all.
Angry screaming. That's okay. That's what politicians sound like now. And he sounds
Here's
like
what we
one
don't
of them.
understand, what we're failing to understand as Democrats. I don't mean you and me personally, but I mean Democrats generally. This idea that Trump and Trumpism are somehow different. No, Trump is a garden variety Republican at this point.
Mm-hmm. And that's what's scary because, again, we talked to normal people. My experience was that during the worst of the Clinton scandals, and my God, he had like 60% approval.
Yeah.
I think Democrats need Monica Lewinsky in their White House. That's the problem. We've never had approval that high since she left. She's the one we need to get back. Like make her chief of staff or something. When I talk to people in the worst part, no one was like upset. Like again, I was living in New York, or I'd go home, even at the church socials or whatever. Everyone's like, "What's the big deal? I like what he's doing. I like Clinton. He's a good guy." And then, also same with George W. Bush. People, liberals didn't like hearing that, but like normal people seemed like, seems like a decent guy. I don't know what he does. You think he's dumb? Do you think I'm dumb? Because I sometimes make,
There it is.
And then Obama, like even a person who was like an average, like that average white lady, and ever single mom's like, oh, he seems like a nice guy, nice family. What? You don't think he's born? Why would he? That seems weird. Why would he not be born in America? Like they don't like. Normal people responding that way. And you go to like Biden, like he's really old. Like he's what to 80? That doesn't make any sense. And he seems old. And people contacted me. I'm in the media. I did not send out my flying monkeys to make everyone think that he was old after that. People came to me and were like horrified. Had one of my best friends. She was like, I couldn't just stop watching. And not even just that you are invested in him winning. It was just more of like, it was just sad to watch, if that makes sense. So that's kind of what we're up against. And so my sense would be we could do better. I know, every argument that folks are making, either they're risk averse or they're denying polls, or they're talking about Harris can't get, no one could get all the money that Biden has raised, that you might as well set on fire. He was outspending Trump for years, uncontested in states in losing them. So more money for something that's not working is not the answer. Whereas the donors now are pulling out.
Yeah.
So, someone's like, well, we need $1 billion. Where are they going to get that money? And I'm like, okay, well, these donors probably could raise $1 billion in 4 months if there's really like that's not compelling to me. I'm not saying that we should switch. I'm just saying that your arguments aren't that compelling to me. So, I think that there are options. The other being that, Gretchen Whitmer or Josh Bureau have no name recognition. My thought there is that this is not really a national race anymore, right? Like, you take every solid Democratic state, you or I would beat Trump there handily, right? Easily. And then it's down to Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. Oh, wait. So maybe the governor who's from Michigan and lives next door to Wisconsin and has pretty good name recognition, and she probably could fly over to Pennsylvania and do some rallies and do well. Vice versa with Josh Shapiro. And again, we're not being racist about saying that those options opposed to Kamala Harris. I get why people would be concerned. And one thing that occurred to me, I want your opinion on this, about why people, because people were saying, and they were making it out to be some grand conspiracy from donors. Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, I'm probably fonder of her than you are, had basically listed out her concerns. But she was saying that these donors were saying they didn't want Harris, they wanted to skip Harris. And it's like, look, I don't know if that's racism. It's just like, if you were looking at, okay, well, Carter's about to get slaughtered. George H.W. Bush is about to get slaughtered. Okay, well, let's put in Mondale. Let's put in Dan Quayle against Bill. That's our chance. Like, no one would think that. Doesn't make any sense, right? It's like this administration's having problems. Right. So I think there's compelling evidence that Biden is the problem. He is uniquely unpopular because of his age, and that the administration has done effective things that we wouldn't necessarily need to distance ourselves from, and that Harris could run on. But I don't think that is inherently disrespectful or racist to think that this is an administration issue. What's your thought?
Well, it's certainly not racist. And this reflexive branding anything we don't like as racism is a big problem in the Democratic Party. Mm-hmm. But I believe that, when something that you're doing clearly is not working, it's folly to stick with it. What was the Einstein quote? It's the definition of insanity is continuing to do the same thing and expecting different results. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're doing. And we can't, unfortunately, get past this idea of we have to have deference for these elderly politicians who probably should no longer be in office. We can't get past this idea that it's not fair. Well, life isn't fair. And I'm sorry to tell people that, but that's just the way it is. Mm-hmm. And so we have all these things that are irritating to Democrats about things that reflect the way the world really is as opposed to the way we would like it to be. And we're just having a very, very hard time getting past that.
Yeah.
And it's going to cost us.
What would you say, again, in your sense of trying to look at this objectively, would be the best chance the Democrats would have of keeping the White House and perhaps flipping the House?
I think that the best chance at this point the Democrats have would be for President Biden to step aside and for the Democratic Party to immediately close ranks behind Vice President Harris. I think that doing anything else would be very, very divisive. I think that it would tear the party apart at a time when we don't need to be torn apart. We need to come together and get behind Vice President Harris and get her out there to take the fight to Donald Trump in a way that Joe Biden is no longer capable of doing if he ever was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Cliston, for coming on for our sort of emergency session. Hopefully things won't change too much before I put this up on what I hope will be Monday. But thank you again for joining me and giving us your insight. And thanks everyone for joining us. Like, share, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thank you.